Hello and welcome back to the Bookshelf Odyssey, and welcome to a series that I'm calling Distracted by Dickens. That's a title I've been wanting to use in some capacity, whether it was a podcast or a reading group or something, but I decided I better use that because it's a fun title, for me anyway. What this will be is a series, at least through Victober, or perhaps longer, where I just talk about Dickens, books about him, topics about him, my thoughts about him. I don't know. I'm kind of leaving it open to be able to explore different topics. And if this does well, I would hope to down the road be able to even bring on like Dickens scholars and everything. I've read a lot about him, but I'm not a scholar at all. I'm an enthusiast, and I love Dickens. I find his life so compelling, and the dynamic of who he was, how he presented himself to the public versus how he was in real life, and how sometimes the two didn't overlap well. He was not a perfect man by any stretch of the imagination. None of us are, of course. Some, tend to be more than others, but he fascinates me and he intrigues me. And as I've told my wife, she always teases me when I buy a new book about Dickens, and she's like, "Oh, you found one you haven't read yet." But buying a book is a lot cheaper than moving to England and studying, getting a master's or something in Dickens studies. So, it's a happy compromise. Well, in a previous video, I mentioned I had like 75, 78, 80 or so books about Dickens, about his work, about his life, biographies, different things. And I've read most of them. I have about 6 or 7 right now that I haven't read yet. And I'm hoping to work on those here this coming year. But what I want to do is share with you some of my favorite books about Dickens. And we need to first off talk about Michael Slater. Michael Slater, if I have the information up to date, Michael Slater is a professor of Victorian literature at Birkbeck College and the University of London. He is the author of many books about Dickens, and I'm pretty sure I have most, if not all of them. He is the Dickens scholar I would recommend going to. If you read only one book about Dickens, I would say pick one of his books. It'd be worth your time. Now, I've been a lifelong fan of Charles Dickens. His first story that I read all the way through was A Christmas Carol as a teenager. I had tried Great Expectations, but it was still a little bit beyond what I could read. And then a couple years later, I got through A Christmas Carol and just fell in love. I'd been reading a lot of his books here and there, but then quite a few years ago now, I had the chance to meet Gerald Dickens. My wife got me bought tickets for Christmas to go see Gerald Dickens, his great-great-grandson, who was performing A Christmas Carol. And it was like a match to gasoline. Okay, it just exploded my interest in all things Dickens. To actually get a chance to meet a direct descendant of Charles Dickens. I mean, I can't go and meet Dickens. He's dead. Okay. But to actually meet a relative of his, shake his hand, get a picture with him was just incredible. And a few years ago on my Christmas podcast, I actually had the privilege of interviewing Gerald Dickens for an episode. And tell you what, I could die a happy man. That was great, and I'm so grateful that Gerald gave his time for my little podcast. Anyway, so around that time, I picked up a biography by Michael Slater. It's relatively new-ish. I mean, I think it was like 2010 it came out. But I got this one just because it was a more modern one. And at the time, I didn't know just how much of a keystone Michael Slater was in the field of Dickens scholarship. This book was and is a chunky boy, okay, but really worth reading. In fact, I'm thinking of actually rereading it here soon, because there were a few parts I skipped because I hadn't read the story yet and I didn't want to have spoilers. But he looks at Dickens's life. He looks at also his work and how the two connected, and offers some thoughtful analysis about Dickens's works and how his life influenced that. Also, I think how Slater handles some of the delicate topics, such as Dickens's alleged affair with Turnin. He handles that with thoughtfulness, I think. I also first read in this book about the Staplehurst crash that Dickens experienced 5 years before he died, and the traumatic impact that had on his life. I mean, it covers everything in great detail. It's a long read, but it's, if you really want to know, just a good, solid foundation of Dickens and who he was as a person and some of his behavior understood through the lens of that time period. This is an excellent, excellent book. If you want to read more about some of the more interesting aspects of Dickens' life, and I use interesting in a, I don't know, funny way, I guess, but Slater also wrote The Great Charles Dickens Scandal, and this really looks more deeply into the subject of his, as I say, of his affair, the breakup with his wife, and what all happened there. I know it's been a while since I've read these, but if I remember right, he really challenges some of the evidence we have, and it might just come down to a he said, she said kind of deal that many people just assumed was true. That tackles a more difficult topic of Dickens's relationship with his wife, and I think he does it more thoughtfully, or does it fairly. Obviously, he doesn't excuse Dickens's behavior. The way he treated his wife, of course, by today's standards, was some would consider to be pretty horrific. And even on some level, how he treated his wife back then was not any better. Would be viewed not as any better. But he balances that with understanding Dickens is also a product of his time and a product of his upbringing, which can play in a lot with that. And for what it's worth, also, I think a lot of what Dickens struggled with was he had some mental health issues that were obviously untreated, undiagnosed, because they just didn't know at that time. Again, not to excuse his behavior. I myself have struggled with depression and anxiety, but that doesn't give me an excuse to to treat my wife like a jerk. Okay, just so we're clear on that. But if you want to read more about that, there is a book Slater wrote that directly addresses those things. And then I also find Dickens's relationship with women to be fascinating. And so Slater's also written a book called Dickens and Women, and that explores the different relationships he had in his life with women, including things with his mother, which may have influenced some of how he wrote women characters. He does talk about the end of their marriage and his relationship with his wife, and of course other women as well. So and then there's a section that looks at the women of his novels, and then the third section just talks about his womanly ideal, and you see that written through a lot of his novels, this ideal woman that he had in mind, that so-called angel of the house. Anyway, Slater explores all those things in detail. Okay, now if you're thinking, what I want is another big honking Dickens biography, well, I've got just the thing for you. Here is one that's considered by many to be the definitive biography of Dickens. I think it's a toss-up between this one and the Michael Slater one. This one, equally mammoth in size, beautifully written by Peter Ackroyd. It's almost at times like poetry, the way he writes. Again, covering Dickens's life, his stories, and yeah, it's a biography of Dickens. Again, one I've read. It's been a while. One I would probably reread just because it's not just informational, but it's interesting. It's beautiful. Really well written story or biography. So this is another one I'd recommend. I don't know much more to say about it. It's a biography. Okay. And then another topic I have interest in, I would love to do more study and reading about this, is this book called God and Charles Dickens by Gary L. College. And it's called, the subtitle there, Recovering the Christian Voice of a Classic Author. And he looks basically at religion in Charles Dickens. And I have a couple other books on that subject. This one was a little more scholarly to read, so it was slower reading, but I thought very interesting. And basically, this explores Dickens's religious thoughts and how that appeared in his writings, and what we can infer from that. So if that's a subject, I'd begin with this, if that's something that fascinates you. But like I said, there's not a lot written about this subject, at least in full-length book form. So that's something I would find real interesting. If I were of their writing sort, do a book on like the theology of Dickens or something. I think that would be very interesting. And then there's a couple books by some relatives of Dickens that I would recommend. One is called My Father as I Recall Him by Mamie Dickens. She is the daughter of Charles Dickens. So this is an older book. As far as I know, this book came out in 1897. That's the date printed in the book. And this is a biography written by his daughter, who had a lot of affection for him. So you want to read it through that lens of, is what she's saying about him actually true or not? Biographies have debated that. But what I loved about it was, this is just a daughter writing about how much she loved her dad and how much he meant to her and some of the things they experienced together. And from that standpoint, this was very interesting, a very good read. It brought character to Dickens that sometimes biographies miss, because she is an eyewitness of him and his behavior and his vibrancy, and so she was able to get that onto page. And then, as I mentioned, Gerald Dickens earlier, Gerald Dickens has actually written a couple of books that I think are worth reading. This one is called Dickens and Staplehurst, a biography of a railway crash, or a rail crash. And Gerald Dickens did a lot of research and study of that time, of what happened when Dickens was on the train that crashed. He was traveling with Ellen, his mistress, and her mother, and it really goes into detail, more than most biographies do, about that day, what all happened, the fallout of that. So this is interesting if you're a Dickens scholar, I think it's interesting, but also if you just love reading about railways and travel from the Victorian era, this would be a good book to read as well. Gerald is not necessarily a writer, although he writes extremely well. I love reading his blog. He's definitely got talent, I think, but he's first and foremost an actor. And so he's able to use that ability to really paint a story of what happened that day when Dickens almost died. And he was right in the middle of writing Our Mutual Friend. So this is of, I think, historical interest. And he also talks about how Dickens very likely got PTSD from that experience. And the trauma of that train crash really impacted some of his writing going forward. And this I didn't realize, but Dickens died 5 years on the very day of that train crash, and how even that points to possible post-traumatic stress. Anyway, a really fascinating book. Gerald Dickens is very readable. So that's a topic that interests you. I would recommend that one. It's surprising we don't have a whole book dedicated, or we didn't have a book dedicated to that train crash until just recently. So very much a significant part of Dickens's life. And then keeping with Gerald Dickens, he also wrote My Life on the Road with A Christmas Carol. And this book was so fun to read. It's basically Gerald talks about his experiences acting in one-man performances of A Christmas Carol. He's done that for, I want to say, over 20 years now. And he's a fantastic actor. If you ever get a chance to see him perform a one-man show, do it. It is money well worth it. A lot of this is just a summary of what he writes on his blog. And he talks about the different events and travels he's had touring around the world with A Christmas Carol, and just kind of the life of an actor. So a lot of fun things to read here. If you're interested in acting, if you're interested in A Christmas Carol, if you're interested in his journey as an actor, and as also a descendant of Dickens, how early in his life he really wanted to try to avoid the comparisons, and then what caused him to eventually just I don't say give up, but just to give in and realize that not only does he care the Dickens name, but that Dickens was a fantastic writer and performer, and Gerald talks a bit about that in his book as well. So this is not really, it's not a scholarly work at all. It's a fun read though. There's a lot here. Even if you've never seen his show, I think you'd enjoy that. But a lot of fun. If I want to say, especially if you're an actor, I think you'd really enjoy this book. Or if you enjoy stage performances and plays and things, this is a great read for that. Okay, that's not everything. I have so much more I could talk about. But I don't want this video to be too long. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you've read something that you found interesting and want to share with me, because I'm always looking to add more to my list and to my shelf. So that will be it today for a tour of my Dickens shelf. I'll probably do more down the road, but I wanted to at least start off with some of my favorite reads from my shelf. But even that doesn't cover it all. At what point do I admit I have a problem? I don't know. We'll see. Okay, that'll do it for today. So stay tuned, because the next Distracted by Dickens video I want to do is talking about the Pickwick Papers. I just reread it recently, and I have some thoughts and things I want to share about that. Might have a special guest on as well to chat a little bit about it. We'll see if we can get our calendars lined up here. But yeah, that'll be it for today. Until next time, I hope that you remain distracted by Dickens. Take care.